Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the air in The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells.
When radio arrived on the scene, people thought it was a miracle. Entertainment and information came right into the home. When Dad was listening to the news, nobody spoke.
This is the National News Bulletin. There are reports of a great naval battle in the South Pacific.
People who didn't have radio would come over to your house and sit around the set and listen.
Be sure to tune in next week for another of Max Morson's thrilling Crime Doctor dramas.
The first attempt at radio in the Okanagan occurred with this equipment right here. It was called 10AY, and the artifacts of that amateur radio station are here in the Kelowna Museum. It was the Brown family that made the plunge to the real thing, as Jim Brown, the son of the founder of CKOV, and his son Jamie Brown told me 20 years ago when I talked to them about their 70th anniversary.
It was an amateur station that was run by a local group of people who carried on with a fellow by the name of George Dunn, who ran the actual physical operation of the station. And then my father tried to convince him to go into commercial radio with him, and he wasn't interested. He was worked for the city, and he couldn't see any reason for getting out of anything like that and going to something so scary as radio. So my dad went into it alone and finally got a license in 1931.
We'll meet several other veterans of Okanagan radio as the program continues, but our main storyteller tonight is Walter Gray, Mayor of Kelowna and founder of several radio stations. As tonight on Pioneers and Places, we look at anecdotes from the history of radio in the Okanagan. Very good evening. Welcome to Okanagan Pioneers and Places. Mike Roberts with you around the big RCA microphone, because tonight we're talking the history of radio in the Okanagan, and this little gentle microphone is part of Chris Cleaver's collection. He's a radiophile, and I have old-time radio host Walter Gray with me right now. In 2001, October, when we're doing this interview for the first time, the Mayor of Kelowna. Welcome, Walter Gray.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. A real pleasure to be able to reflect in the past.
We are talking on these microphones right now, but because they kind of get in the way of television, we're going to make the transition to these little microphones on our necks, okay? So can we do that? We'll just sort of push this back. Oh, that was a heavy,
yeah.
beast. 1, 2, 1, 2. Are we coming through loud and clear?
Hello.
How are you?
I'm fine.
Thank you for consenting to do this story of radio, because when we think 2001, 1931 was when CKOV started. 1971 was when you started CKIQ Radio.
That's correct. We both celebrate the birthday in the same week.
It's September in both cases?
November in both cases.
Is that November in both cases? Now, what accounted for the fact that CKOV had the valley essentially to itself for 40 years?
Well, I mean, back then, of course, the valley was a very small place. There weren't as many radio signals. The 630 frequency carried forever and ever, and CKIQ came along on the 40th anniversary of CKOV merely because the population had increased, there was room for competition and choice.
Let's go back to first radio. We've got some tape too, which we might drop in occasionally. I haven't changed at all in this tape, but we've got Jim Brown Sr. and Jamie Brown, his son, who were son and grandson of the founder of CKOV, who was Jim Brown as well, but he was JHB?
And he was referred to as Big Jim.
He was J.W.B. Brown, but he was also called Big Jim.
Marion Buse was the executive secretary to all 3 generations of the Brown family.
Well, each of them were very individual. Mr. Brown was a big, hefty man. So, of course, was young Jim. Young Jim was J.H. Brown, and then Jamie was Jamie. And each of them had their own ways of doing things. It was always interesting, and they were great to work for. Mr. Brown was called the white-haired philosopher, and he used to read poems, mainly by Patience Strong, for, I think, a quarter-hour program once a week. Programs were made up of quarter hours, half, and hours. And in the early days, we always wrote the programs ahead. Nowadays, the disc jockeys wing it. Is that what you say? But in the earlier days, all the programs were written ahead. The music selected and written ahead.
Marion Buse was also the station's first female announcer.
I was in the office at that time, one of the office staff, and Harry Watts, who was on our staff, a young Penticton fellow, had to read an ad for Fumertons, and they were featuring bras and panties. And he said, "Oh gosh, I can't read this stuff. Marion, you do it." And I said, No. And he said, "Come on." So I said, "Okay." And I went in and read it on air and came out and sat down. And pretty soon Mr. Brown came out of his office and he said, "I just had a call from Insula Hardy." And she said, "Who's that female announcer you've got?" And Mr. Brown said, "Oh, no, we don't have a female announcer." So he came out to tell us this little joke. And Harry spoke up and said, "Oh, yes, we have. That was Marion." And Mr. Brown said, "Oh, why don't you tell me these things?" And so he had to go back to Insula Hardy and phone her and tell her that it was me. And she said, "I'd like her to do my advertising after this." So that's how it started.
When you see a photograph like this, the voice of the Okanagan, CKOV Kelowna, CKOK Penticton, read the latest news direct from the Toronto newsroom. I mean, there was a lot of romance associated with a lot of wires and tubes and heat, wasn't there?
Well, and certainly when they plugged in the news, of course, you heard that big booming voice, "This is Lauren Green with the National News." So radio had, a big city feel, even though it came out of small little local transmitters with some local programming.
As a kid, what attracted you to radio? What did it supply you?
Well, I was in the radio drama club at school, and I don't know what attracted me to that. I thought I might like to go into radio, and I remember in grade 11 and 12 everyone saying, "Well, why would you want to go into radio? CHBC's just signed on. Why wouldn't you go into television? Radio will be dead, it'll be passé, it'll be gone." But I didn't believe that. And then I worked at CKOV, started there as the night person, and then eventually I was the morning guy, replacing at one point Grandpappy Jackson, who was an absolute fixture in the community for many, many years.
Now, this is Grandpappy Jackson, and he's with a guy who's with CJIB radio in this picture.
Yes, that was Don Warner. He was also an institution in radio in the Vernon area and did play-by-play hockey, and he was on the radio as well.
Now, Grandpappy Jackson must have had an attitude. I wish we had tape or some kind of way to tell him. What was his delivery? What was his style? What attracted you to him?
Well, I don't have an absolute recall. I had a fascination for radio, so I listened to him as a teenager. Probably didn't have any other choice. It was essentially the only radio station around in those days. But he was early radio. You got up in the morning and you heard commercials and you heard music and you heard the news and you heard who told what joke in the restaurant the previous day, and that was early radio.
Going to take a break here. Be back in just a second, though, to talk about the radio stations and how they coordinated in the Okanagan. Before we get to IQ, we'll do all of that in the program still to come. Don't go away. Jamie Brown was the last member of his family to manage CKOV radio. How did CKOK steal the broadcast license from CKOV?
This is one of those wonderful bureaucratic stories that goes back in time when they considered CKOV to be Canada, Kelowna, Okanagan Valley, the voice of the Okanagan. Therefore, you weren't allowed as a family to own two broadcast licenses in one market. We considered Penticton to be a distinctly separate market from Kelowna. So my grandfather went and got a license using the name of a person in Penticton. So the license was technically held in that person's name. The shares of the company were technically held in that person's name, but there was a behind-the-scenes agreement that it really did belong to my grandfather. Unfortunately, this person decided that New York City and the allure of the company secretary was greater than staying in Penticton. So off he went with the secretary, the shares, and the license, sold it, and there was nothing we could do about it because in paper it wasn't ours.
That was in 1948. CKOK became Penticton's radio station, and CKOV continued to be the voice of the Central Okanagan. And it was in the late 50s that Walter Gray met his future business partner, Bob Hall of Salmon Arm.
Walter Gray was a high school student the first time I met him. I used to have to read the newscast at 10 o'clock at night, and this one night I was reading the news and this young whippersnapper walked in and he said, "I've got a story for you." And I didn't know who he was, and the story was a good story. He had been driving down Ellis Street, he saw a house on fire, he went in, he rescued a girl in the fire, carried her out, and came right down to the radio station, and Walter always wanted to be in radio. And we just, from then on, just clicked. And in 1965, we applied for a license in the early part of the year. We were granted the license in July, and we were on the air in November. The funny part I could tell you about Walter Gray is, when we signed on our stations in Salmon Arm, he was known as Wide Awake Walt, because he did the morning show. And the day we signed on, he was there. We were all there at 5:30 in the morning to sign the station on at 6. And we were all excited, but we had been working 36 straight hours to get on the air. So the day went fine. The next day, Walter slept in. And we get a phone call at 20 after 7 saying, "Have you guys quit already?" So I ran over and I shook Walter awake because we were sharing an apartment. Gene hadn't moved here yet. And I said, "Walter, we didn't get on the air." So we ran down and got on the air. People thought that was quite funny.
Take a break. We're going to come back and talk about CKIQ, and once you get two stations in the market, you begin to get some interesting competitions and conflicts going on. We'll do that right after this break. Welcome back to Okanagan Pioneers and Places. Mike Roberts with Walter Gray talking about the history of radio in the Okanagan. How did the folks at OV feel about this newcomer on the block?
Well, I don't think any business necessarily wants competition, but certainly they rise to the challenge, and CKOV did that when CKIQ came on the air in 1971. Bob Hall and I had both worked at CKOV. Me right out of school. Bob was pretty young too, although 10 years my senior, I must tell you. And we had already left Kelowna and been to Salmon Arm and established radio stations in Salmon Arm and Revelstoke, the Big R. And then we had the opportunity to build in Kelowna, and I moved back. Bob lost the toss, as it were, and he stayed in Salmon Arm, although he and his family love it there. And so CKOV rose to the competition. They found their niche. I believe at one point in time they moved to a country format. And we focused more on news and personality-oriented radio. And over the years, a lot of people wound up working at both stations. Bob Harrison worked for both companies at one time.
John Michaels.
John Michaels. A lot of people, yeah.
There was a sense of adventure, too. I don't know how to put this and not insult good old radio guys, but it was a bit of a wild industry.
Oh, it was very, very swinging door, migratory, didn't pay very much money. It did it for the love of it, and some people even survived and made a career of it.
How do you manage? Okay, here's the good businessman has to keep the company rolling, but you're employing a bunch of wackos who just, anarchy is their friend. How do you meld these two?
Cages. We had cages. I was the only one with a key to the lock.
What's it like running a business that employs a bunch of wild men?
Well, the sheriff arrives in the middle of an announcer's shift. He's not quite over, and the sheriff is here to arrest him because he's due in court, and he's been hoping this issue would go away, and it didn't. So you convince the sheriff to wait at least until the news break happens before they pick him up by the scruff of the neck and cart him off to the judge so you could get someone to fill in. In the meantime, you go down there in your suit and tie and sit in the front row and stare at the judge and saying, yes, I'll be responsible for this young man. And then you get him back on shift so you don't have to double pay someone to sit there and babysit the microphone while you're paying this guy to be in court.
How many times did a thing like that happen?
Once or twice.
Everybody's got to come up with an April Fool's joke.
That's
and
right.
It was, I believe, O.V. and John Michaels who came up with metric time.
I was working above the TD Bank. There were some wonderful old studios that were there, CKOV, doing the talk show. And the year before, the federal government had brought in the metric conversion. Now, this is where we went from inches to centimeters and yards to meters. The big one was going from Fahrenheit to Celsius, which really had everybody screwed up. And just before we can, and remember now, they started this on April the 1st. I'm not sure what the year was. So a year later, we're coming up on April Fool's Day, and we thought it would be a good idea to go into a metric time conversion. One of our news people, Terry McKinnon, played the part of the bureaucrat in Ottawa. We put him through an equalizer. He sounded long distance. And we interviewed the doctor, a Swede, who came up with metric time, Slurf Lurpra. And if you look at that, that's actually April Fool's backwards, and nobody caught on. Here's the deal. Now, the idea of metric time was the 24 hours was now going to be 10. So midnight was 0, 6 a.m. was 2.5, noon was 5, 6 p.m. was 7.5. The neat thing is you only need one hand. So the conversion, the watch and the clock conversion, is you pop the crystal off, get rid of the small hand on your watch, and just use one hand. And we pulled this off dead serious. And we had people calling in. It was awful, as a matter of fact. I've never heard so much hate in my life. Well, actually, I have, but I was a lawyer, and that's a different story. So anyway, that was happening. There was man-in-the-street interviews. CHBC was all over the story. Some TV stations from out of town came in. And we never sort of said it was an April Fool's joke. I was on location the next day at Orchard Park. There was people coming up to our little trailer there, and we were telling them, sure, go into the bay and they'll put the conversion on for you. And the bay was really upset with us. And the feds had hired a couple here to help people through the real metric conversion. And that's where the lawsuit came in, and Jamie Brown handled it nicely. He said, go ahead and sue us. And that's basically the story. It was great fun.
Promotion, promotion, promotion. And competition between the stations.
Well, it's like Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola, and I think that wound up being very healthy for the people that lived in the valley, because you had this hot competition between CKIQ and CKOV. I remember two of the things that come to mind with CKIQ, where we were trying to really capture the loyalty of the market. And that was our first promotion, which was about our 5th anniversary, and we did a promotion to get all our listeners to throw money in the pot, and we bought the very first Jaws of Life for the Kelowna Fire Department, very first Jaws of Life in the whole Okanagan Valley. And this was seen as a tremendous thing. I think they were about $7,000 or $9,000 at the time, but nonetheless, it was a big deal at the time. And then a few years later, in fact, I think it was in about 1981, we had another promotion called I Want to Live. And really what that was trying to use the power of radio to create attitudinal changes of people who largely listen to radio in their car radios, and try to train them and get them to buy into responsibility as a driver, not just drinking and driving, but the distance you keep behind the other car, school zones, those sort of things. In fact, we're very proud of the fact that the I Want to Live idea, which was created by Cliff Cleaver, not Chris Cleaver, Cliff Cleaver, who was our sales manager at the time, we won the National Community Service Station of the Year award, beating out CFRB, the biggest station in Canada, and we were really delighted with that. And that all happened in a little market like Kelowna, and you know, CKOV wasn't going to sit down and let us beat them at that, so they'd come up with great promotions as well, and radio was really exciting and valuable in this market.
Well, I thought you were going to say that your first promotion was the turn in your knobs to the radio station. I mean, when you went on the air, you said,
that right?
Send in your knobs, set the dial to 1150?
That's right.
And then tear the knob off your radio and send it in to us so you can't change back to the other station.
Well, I wasn't going to mention that because you're right. We got a truckload of radio knobs, which meant, of course, people could never turn back to CKOV again. It worked for a while, but then as people bought new radios, a lot of them tended to buy FM radios or AM, FM, but it worked well, and I'm glad you remembered the promotion. I had completely forgotten.
But there must be a box of knobs somewhere.
Somewhere. And whoever it is that has them out there, would you please send them, because they'd be valuable now.
No, you'd have, you can't hardly get good knobs anymore. Oh, Lord,
There'd
that's
be
crazy.
oak ones and there'd be plastic ones. I mean, oh my God.
Now, this character here, we have a particular affinity for this guy because behind that leather flying helmet is Chris Cleaver.
Yes.
So has he actually worked at every station in town?
And on the planet pretty well.
Saturday mornings I did a show on CKIQ and we called it the Lost Gonzo Breakfast Show. And it used to be, the line was, it's the Lost Gonzo Breakfast Show emanating from the fabulous crystal gondola perched high atop our palatial main studios on the Mission Creek mudflats. When in reality it was just a little room in the dark, but people out there thought it was this fabulous control room filled with gears, pulleys, levers, and connections all over the world that we could bring in different voices and sounds and music from everywhere, and it was quite a lot of fun.
We haven't mentioned the advent of the third radio station, which, of course, Nick Frost, we have a picture of Nick, and he worked for you and Chim FM, and then he started his station, Silk FM.
He was actually brought to Kelowna by our company in 1971. He was our night announcer, and he was an operator this night when we were broadcasting, can you believe it, Fastball. And that was the night our station burned down, and Nick was the first to know when the smoke was coming up in the control room, and he was a pipe smoker, so it took him a long time to figure it out.
And a fellow named Sandy Brown was doing his sports play-by-play of one of the local teams then. This was in 1971. And I was there in the control room putting the commercials in and making sure that his volume was fine. And Sandy told me years later, he said, Nick, the signal went dead. And I thought it was you. You'd done something wrong in the control room. I was quite new to radio then. And he tried to phone. I said, it's not me, Sandy. I think the place is burning up. And it was.
We rebuilt the station and got back on the air in our original location out on Highway 97 1 year later. It took a year to rebuild.
Right. Well, the time is up already. I can't believe it, but if I were to sit down a few of your old cronies in here, we could do several hours worth of this kind of stuff. But I thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
It's great to have you here.
I
nearly broke something laughing there.
Thanks for bringing it all back.
Walter Gray, who of course started CKIQ Radio, our storyteller today as we looked at the history of radio. See you again next time.